Talk Show.
Recorded live.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I was asked to break down the 1933 bankruptcy for the new listeners that may come on the show, to give them a simpler understanding of what happened in 1933. So we're going to try to break this down into something simple that they can comprehend, but then they're going to have to get into the regular archives to get up to speed, because we're not going to be able to keep this on Basic 101 for our entire lifetime, because when you do that, you'll never grow. And we have been growing leaps and bounds on AIB radio. So this is going to be just a special call for those who want to understand the bankruptcy side of the Basic 101 issue on this. All right, basically what happened here back in 1912, 1913, the Federal Reserve came into existence into this country. This is where they went down to Jekyll Island, and several of the congressmen agreed to allow them to take over the banking system of this country, which means they allowed them to take over the economics, the banks and the money aspect of this. 1916, in the congressional records, McAdoo was the Treasury Secretary, sat down and went before Congress and told him that this was really a real bad idea, because the Federal Reserve was nothing more than a private corporation. It was a trust fund. It was not a bank. It was a trust. It was a private corporation. It was an entirely separate entity from the United States. The Constitution of the United States allowed Congress to coin our own money in gold and in silver. And we had our own mints in our own country to coin our own money. Well, whenever the Federal Reserve came into effect, shortly after 1913, 1917, World War I started. The Federal Reserve went over to Germany during World War I and told them, if you want to create a war, the only way that you can create it is if you use our currency. You can't use yours, you have to use ours. Otherwise, you'll never be able to buy supplies and get the stuff that you need in order to run your war. What this did, this allowed the Federal Reserve to collect off of both sides and make money off both sides during the war. Move this thing up to where we're at in 1916, 1917. Lindbergh brought charges against the Federal Reserve for embezzling. They brought impeachment charges for misuse of the people's money. 1932, 1933, McFadden also brought charges. It sits here and showed that from the 1920s up through, the Federal Reserve removed out of this country $60.5 billion in gold bullion the first time, $58 billion in gold bullion the second time, and like $15 billion the third time. Now, they removed all the gold. What the agreement was this. All these local banks that had gold deposits had to remove the gold out of their banks and turn it over to the Federal Reserve. They handed all the gold. The Federal Reserve, in turn, handed them what is known as Federal Reserve notes. It is a promise to pay back. It was never lawful money at the time. It was strictly an internal currency. That Federal Reserve note, according to McFadden's speech in 1933, it was not backed by any gold, not so much as a penny's worth. it was nothing more than an IOU. And this is where you get into Title 12 under Section 411, and it would tell you that the Federal Reserve note is an obligation of the United States, not of the people. It's an obligation of the United States. As you get in and start reading some of the congressional records on this, and I did a show here a while back, and I read the congressional records that showed that the Federal Reserve note was nothing more than a credit line of the people. Whenever you got a Federal Reserve note, it was an IOU. It was credit. It was never lawful money. It was never to be redeemed at that time. So whenever you are dealing with a mortgage and you're going down to the bank, you're signing a promissory note. That promissory note was supposed to have been turned over to the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve was supposed to withdraw the money out of their bank and pay the owner of the person that you bought the property off of. What happened here was this, is that you not only signed the promissory note, but you also had the bank slip in a mortgage note that you would refinance and pay the bank back for what they borrowed out of your account. You'd pay the bank back for what they borrowed out of your account. That's what that promissory note was. This is part of what's getting into the congressional records of McFadden, what he was sitting here explaining, and into Lindbergh of what he was sitting here explaining. So when you're going down to a bank and you're borrowing what you think is money, you are actually giving them your signature. That signature is what is collateral, because they turn that signature over to the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve, in turn, creates more Federal Reserve notes. They don't create money, they create more Federal Reserve notes, which is another debt line. It's a credit line. We have been lied to. We've been frauded on all of this. The simplicity of all this is, according to the speeches that McFadden made in 1932, 1933, is that every time you sign a sheet of paper, it gets turned over to the Federal Reserve, and they turn around and securitize on it. This is what Mr. Raja has sit here and has explained, and is going to explain here on Friday night show of the 28th. He's going to sit down and show you how he put a signature on a mortgage note, how the banks turn around and they securitize a $500,000 note into a $93 million profit on their side. The problem of it is they did not pay any of the taxes. They didn't pay any of the public debt off. If you would look under Title 12 and you get into the banking registration under 95A, 95B, and just plain Title 12, 95, this is the regulations and the obligations of the bank. Once you read that Title 12, 95, 95A, 95B, ladies and gentlemen, this deals with the state of emergency. In 1933, when they passed what was known as HJR 192, which is House Joint Resolution, they turned it into a public law called Public Law 10, Chapter 48, 48 Stat 112. This is where they came in and took all of your gold off of the people in this country, all of it. This is where the Executive Order 6102 comes in. This is where you were charged $10,000 and 10 years in jail if you did not comply with relinquishing all your gold and silver. What they did not tell you is they also passed H.R. 1491, which is Public Law 1, 48 Stat C 1, and Public Law 73-10 40 Stat 411, which is HR 4960. Whenever they pass Public Law 1, 48 Stat C1, which is House Resolution 1491, this is where your licensing comes in. This is where the deeds, this is where your signature comes in. This is where you're handing everything over to the government. The moment you sign it over to the government, they now can use it for collateral. They can now securitize on it. They're not supposed to take your property. That property belongs to you. But this allows them to turn around and does finances. The thing of it is, you can only finance so much on a piece of property that only has so much value. They have extended this. So what they've done, this is why they have come in and they have confiscated your property so they can get it out of your name, sell it to somebody else, so they can turn it right around and re-securitize on it off of somebody else. This is where the fraud's coming in. They was never supposed to be able to take your property. They have. We need to have a better understanding of the bankruptcy of 1933 and really what it means. This is why the congressional records of what Lindbergh was talking about and what McFadden was talking about, and all this is on the website under rodclassteam.com. Get into the bankruptcy side of this thing. Once you start reading the congressional records and they start spelling it out and they start laying it out, you will start understanding the fraud that has been perpetrated on you, all under the name of state of emergency. The state of emergency is their biggest issue, and this is why when you walk into the courts and you try to bring up anything on the bankruptcy, the judge immediately shuts you down. He's not going to allow you to bring in anything under the bankruptcy. And that's because the moment you do, that sits here and shows the fraud of what the court is operating under. It sits here and shows you that the court now has to discharge the debt. This is where your birth certificate comes in. Because if you look under that the HR 1491, which is that Public Law 1, 48 Stat C1, and they tied this thing into the Trading with the Enemy Act, which is at 4960 under Public Law 73-10, 40 Stat 411, you can run this back into Title 50. Title 50 is War and National Defense. Take us into Chapter 3. It says Alien Enemy. Take it into Section 23, Jurisdiction of the Courts and the Judges. It's criminal. This is how they're running you and I in these courtrooms. This is why they don't want you to bring in anything under the bankruptcy. Because once you start bringing in the bankruptcy, it shows that they are bringing you in as an alien enemy into that courtroom. Well, if you are an alien enemy, then this falls back under the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act under Title 28, 1602 to 1611. They don't have jurisdiction over you. But if you are an alien enemy in your own country, then what does this make them? Makes them foreigners also. This is why they don't ever want you to bring up the bankruptcy side. That's why they ever don't want you to talk about this. Because once you start understanding and you start exposing this, now you're exposing the fact that they are not paying off the public debt. They're not paying any of the bills. They're embezzling all of it. This is what McFadden was getting into in his congressional record. This is what Lindbergh was getting into in their congressional records. 1917, 1932, 1933. This is what they were breaking down. This is what they were explaining. Once you have the understanding that your signature is collateral, and this allows the Federal Reserve to make more Federal Reserve notes.
Is this really America? Where did America go?
People, this is what we're sitting down saying.